There's nothing quite like the comfort of your own home after a busy morning at work. But you know, it's not so long ago that the idea of owning a home of your own was little more than a dream for most people. In the olden days, property was controlled by an elite group of people called capitalists. Even small and poorly built houses and apartments were ludicrously expensive. Simple and affordable social housing, such as this place, was non-existent. These days we take our social infrastructures for granted. Aside from plentiful affordable housing, we also enjoy the cheapest, most efficient rail travel in Europe, the best equipped public health service in the world, not-for-profit essential utilities such as electricity and communications, and of course our universally acclaimed policy of free education for all. In the past, however, the provision of these state-subsidised services was quite frankly unimaginable. I'm talking, of course, of the pre-allotment period. The prosperous and equitable freedoms that we all expect today were inconceivable and enjoyed only by an elite minority, a section of society born into privilege who constituted what was then known as the ruling class. These people had inherited their wealth from their forefathers, who in turn had enriched themselves through the trade of human cargo and the imperial rape of nations. The ruling class owned all the land, ran the government, and were privately schooled. They held dominion over the masses through manipulation, propaganda, and oppression. Ordinary people were forced into cheap labour, sacrificed in vanity conflicts, and expected to pledge allegiance to a geriatric head of an inbred family called the Windsors. It sounds bizarre, but incredibly, it's all true. But the days of the ruling class were numbered. A cataclysmic series of self-inflicted blows, treacherous skullduggery, and a glorious proletariat revolt led by a maverick botanist would bring to an end centuries of assured power. Join me as I delve deep into England's past to uncover a bitter conflict between the haves and the have-nots. It's a tale of biological research, state-sponsored larceny, and a failed political experiment assisted by a nefarious and unethical press. Through the images and newsreels of the time, I'll tell the true and incredible story of how a nation was driven to the brink of destruction by a febrile pederast gentry, and how an allotment-tending trade unionist, famed more for his love of bean soup than his passion for power, rose from his cabbage patch to vanquish the ancestral elite and become our most revered statesman. When hope seemed all but lost, one man changed everything. Jeremy Corbyn has entered the annals of history as undoubtedly England's greatest ever Prime Minister. However, in order to fully appreciate the magnitude of the man and his achievements, it is important to examine the period of history that led to his appointment and reflect on the events that shaped his political consciousness and paved the way for his radical revolution. Therefore, we must begin, as all intriguing tales do, at the beginning, or at least in this case, Corbyn's beginning. When Jeremy Bernard Corbyn was born the son of peace activists on May 26, 1949, the United Kingdom, as it was then known, was undergoing a period of unprecedented change. Traditional class divisions were being steadily dismantled by a relentless socialist revolution. The dominant conservative ruling class had more or less remained uninterrupted for centuries, having gained its wealth and power through slavery and imperialism. Government consisted of born-to-rule, self-entitled patriarchal elites and the landed gentry who defined themselves from the lower classes not only by their wealth and status, but by their unusual and peculiar customs, such as primogeniture, the passing of the estate and title to the eldest son by means of sodomy. Yet when young Master Corbyn exited the birth canal, the British establishment was in freefall. 2 world wars had liquidated generations of plebeians. When conflict finally ceased, it became clear to the elites that any return to a compliant, servile population was not on the cards. Living conditions of the lower classes had barely improved in a century and were all but Dickensian. The battle-weary had seen their comrades obliterated and spilled their blood for king and country. They were tired of jingoism and now sought recompense for their endurance in the form of radical social improvement. The custodians of power and representatives of all political parties sensed a real and present danger. The men returning from war-ravaged Europe were no longer mere civilians. They were trained combatants and were disciplined in military procedure. Any potential civil unrest now held grave implications. A disenfranchised angry populace was one thing. Equip the same demographic with the art of warfare, and Guy Fawkes' dream seemed a far more feasible reality. Throughout the war, the aristocrat conservative Winston Churchill had led a coalition government. But when the warfare ceased, the British public rejected the ruling class's Conservative Party and instead voted overwhelmingly in favour of Clement Attlee's Socialist Labour Party, setting in motion the greatest civic and social reforms ever seen. The creation of a welfare state to support the vulnerable, a national health service offering free healthcare at the point of need, massive social housing programmes and full employment, industries such as coal mining, transport, railways and energy were nationalised in the public interest, and universal access was granted to primary, secondary and tertiary education. The improvement and enrichment to the lives of the lower classes was breathtaking. This domestic hammer blow to the supremacy of the ruling class was further fortified by the rejection of imperialism by the subjugated colonial peoples of Africa, Asia and the Indian subcontinent. The British Empire was disintegrating. Thus it was within this context of prosperity and opportunity for working people that Jeremy Bernard Corbyn embarked upon his socialist political odyssey, displaying an uncanny ability to appear at some of the most seismic events in post-war history.
Castro rode in glory into Havana. Cubans, hundreds of thousands of them.
I have a dream. My poor little children.
Described as the summit of a footballer's ambition. How much greater was the triumph.
He plays very good guitar. He's a very good guitar player. It's better than you.
Yeah.
One small step for man. One giant leap for man.
But dark forces were at play that would catastrophically undermine the state's newfound ethical and moral ideology. Horrified at the sight of the establishment capitulating to the working classes, a rogue band of upper-class conservatives began a plot that sought not only to halt the socialist fungi, but to fatally poison the Marxist mycelium itself. The eugenicist Keith Joseph and arch-racist Enoch Powell made contact with a demented Austrian economist named Friedrich von Hayek, who shared their hatred of socialist values. Together they began a secret programme to combat the egalitarian nightmare into which they found themselves. Disgusted by the impotence of Tory brass in the face of the Red Plague, they determined that an effective leader would have to be created from scratch, honed in their own image. They enlisted the support of Grand Etonian poultry magnate Anthony Fisher, who was now experimenting in biological research. After much deliberation and in the spirit of Mary Shelley, they concluded to inseminate a bovine embryo with the semen of a non-screengrocer from the market town of Grantham, growing the political mutant in a giant petri dish in Fisher's laboratory. It would take time, but the patience of these maverick toff scientists would be ferociously rewarded with the creation of the ultimate bastard panjandrum. By the time Jeremy Corbyn returned to London to begin his vocation as a socialist acolyte, the post-war confidence of the unionised working classes appeared invincible, crystallised by the overthrow of Edward Heath's sexually corrupt government. The masses had tasted the fruits of prosperity and were in no mood to back down. The establishment reeled at the ever-decreasing gap between the rich and the poor. Yet just as the last flames of their cherished empire were all but extinguished, salvation for the elites duly arrived. The deranged Tory scientists stepped forth, and to the delight of a jubilant, demented ruling class, unleashed their mutant sociopath upon the masses. The Thatcher was born. Requiring only 4 hours rest per night and unicising all in her path, the earnest young Corbyn could now only watch on in horror as the freakish beast systematically savaged the post-war gains, and with the assistance of the state media and pathetic compliance of right-wing trade unionists, subjected the people to a tsunami of neoliberal misery. Beginning with a needless conflict over a South Atlantic archipelago, and progressing to the wholesale auction of the nation's assets to their partisan associates, the lunatic Chimera and her henchmen wreaked an epic trail of destruction. Whilst the City of London was coated in the shiny, glistening ejaculate from deregulated markets, industries that had sustained the common people, such as mining, shipbuilding, and steel manufacturing, were obliterated, consigning entire communities to poverty and atrophy. Throughout the Conservative reign of terror, the Labour Party had proven to be inept and befuddled in opposition. Jeremy Corbyn had held true to his principles, fighting for the rights of the dispossessed, but he held no particular influence over the party and was regularly the subject of ridicule on account of his day wear. No one, least of all himself, could have predicted the tremendous impact he would ultimately have upon the fortunes of the nation. Seduced, intoxicated and inspired by the Thatcher's neoliberal politics of avarice and greed, a rapacious psychotic narcissist seized the opportunity to exploit the desultory Labour Party. Donning the coat of Keir Hardie or that of Milton Friedman, depending on his audience, Anthony Charles Linton Blair, or TB, was a new wave knave who glibly grinned his way to the helm of the Labour Party, bringing the Reds back to power after a near 20-year hiatus. But much like his pulmonary infecting namesake, TB had brought his own rotten disease direct to the capillaries of the Labour Party, espousing the tragic neoliberal policies of increased privatisation and introducing the insidious practice of billing for study.
Education, education and education.
The most precious advances secured in the wake of the war fallen were being trampled on by the very institution responsible for their creation. Yet for Jeremy Corbyn, worse was to come. By far the greatest casualty of the Thatcher's cancerous neoliberalism had been the pathetic acquiescence of the Fourth Estate. The once noble profession of independent forensic inquiry had debased itself into unctuous state sycophancy. Journalists prostituted themselves to decrepit media barons, defecating on Pulitzer's honour, publishing press releases verbatim, and reducing their trade to little more than spineless political stenography. This combination of negligence and bootlicking from the stenographers engendered a nadir of post-accountability that would culminate in tragic and deadly consequences. Freebasing on his own self-image and driven by corporate imperialism, TB and his satanic director of communications, Colonel Campbell, mounted an illegal military offensive on the sovereign state of Iraq. Corbyn vehemently opposed the warfare, but his cries fell on deaf ears as the cheerleading stenographers propagated a tide of lies to justify the barbarity and slaughter.
September the 11th was a dreadful event. 8,000 deaths in Afghanistan brought back none of those who died in the World Trade Center. Thousands more deaths in Iraq will not make things right. It will set off a spiral of conflict, of hate, of misery, of desperation that will fuel the wars, the conflict, the terrorism, the depression and the misery of future generations.
Decades of rampant economic abuse by the rabid dogs of neoliberalism had brought the economy to its knees. Sensing the forthcoming fiscal storm, TB, ever the opportunist, jumped the ship of state, leaving Captain Gordon Browneye at the helm. In a bizarre effort to stabilise the floundering vessel, the incompetent Browneye delivered the ship's booty to the financial pirateers of the city, bequeathing the entire social wealth of the nation to a corporate banking Cosa Nostra. Exploiting the absence of polity, a talentless boy band of Tory delinquents, led by a pedophile and managed by a repulsive, ageing Antipodean, scurried from the gates of Eton to snatch control. The British public would now be subject to a horrendous period of the most degrading social and cultural abasement. In the desire to salvage their imperial past and to support their lavish, depraved lifestyles, the privileged brats imposed a vicious austerity on the masses, punishing the poor for the financial crimes of the rich. Opposition was crushed by vile propaganda from the British State Broadcasting Corporation and the establishment's media oligarchs who promoted division over race, identity and human rights. Politicians, press and police engaged in a licentious, amoral menage a trois.
It clicked through onto her voice now, so I heard her voice.
Yes.
And it was just like a jump. She's picked up her voicemails, Bob, she's alive! And I was just, it was then, really.
Objective political analysis was discarded in favour of contrived government PR hosted by old school ties. A humiliating diet of bread and circuses, in conjunction with benefit sanctions, zero-hour contracts, rampant unemployment and food poverty, was inflicted on the people. Yet it was here, quite incredibly, in this bleak and depressing climate of casino capitalism, where public money was siphoned into private pockets, where human values were second to capital gain, and where lies transcended the virtue of truth, that Corbyn's miraculous revolution would begin. The Labour Party's response to the odious policies of the Eton Toffs had been paltry. Members of the PLP masqueraded as socialists to secure their constituency seats whilst hiding their Blairite bacillus. These careerist impostors insulted the principles of the movement and rendered the party impotent and ineffectual in opposition. Having witnessed the humiliating defeat of their leader, Ed Miliband, at the hands of a ravenous bacon roll, the Labour Party now sought new guidance. Buoyant on the subsidised ale of the Commons Sports and Social Club, a group of Labour flunkies charged with selecting leadership candidates engaged in a mischievous prank. a challenge was set to identify and nominate the most unlikely individual imaginable to earn the role of leader. In an explosion of mirth and through tears of laughter, the name Jeremy Corbyn was scrawled onto the list. Incredibly, rather than dismiss his nomination as puerile horseplay, Corbyn confirmed his intention to run. The drunken miscreants immediately regretted their antics. It appeared that Joe Public quite liked the bearded botanist, whilst his neo-Blairite opponents struggled to fill a classroom. Corbyn drew crowds of thousands, advocating a return to public investment, heavy taxation of the rich, and the abolishment of austerity. The masses swelled with approval.
Jeremy Corbyn,
To the wide-eyed astonishment of the metropolitan elites, Corbyn stormed his way to victory, crowning himself leader of the Labour Party. This heady scent of left-wing unity sent a lightning bolt of terror through the heart of the establishment. As new members flocked to join Corbyn's Labour Party, the threat of a resurgent, unified working class set abject panic amongst the elites. In a frenzied effort to drown the nascent socialist fetus, the establishment media cartels conspired to manufacture industrial levels of anti-Corbyn excrement.
It's not true, so
Yet in a sweet historical paradox, the ultimate destruction of the plutocratic ruling class would be catalysed not so much from a renascent socialist Labour Party, but rather more so from vicious internecine strife. Seeking to flog every remaining public asset free from the constraints of the European Court of Justice, a solo-testicled public school spiv in league with the Monday Club racists began a civil war against the Eton delinquents by way of referendum, whipping the public into a frenzy by falsely attributing the strain on public services to EU immigration policy as opposed to decades of disinvestment.
Muslims coming in.
England to be free.
The rate's gone up. The children, the deaths.
let's take our country back.
The crime rate, it's not gone up.
20, 30 years, there won't be any white, they will all be coloured.
Get them out!
Stabbing, reports of a shooting in Bristol.
Cox supported Britain staying in the European Union.
Thomas May say Britain first. This is for Britain. Britain will always come first.
The coup was successful. The public voted to leave the European Union by means of Brexit. Bewildered by the treachery, the pegophile resigned, to be replaced by a xenophobic termagant harbouring a repatriation fetish. As the atrocious terms of the Brexit became public, a furious sense of betrayal swept the populace. Businesses, banks and capital fled the City of London to the sanctuary of Europe. Wages collapsed, whilst unemployment and hunger rocketed. To zero opposition, the Spanish government annexed Gibraltar as British squaddies refused to defend a timeshare tax haven in the south of Spain. The deportation of immigrant health professionals pulverised the withering NHS. Without benefit of treatment, the sick were subject to death by trolley side, wheeled from crowded corridors direct to the morgue. The plucky Scotch, exasperated by their political marginalisation, declared UDI and left the United Kingdom, compounding the apocalyptic Westminster crisis. Riots erupted on the streets of every major conurbation.
Britain, where violence and looting spread to 3 other cities last night. It is Britain's worst rioting in 25 years.
Theresa May is facing fresh calls to resign.
A stunned silence there from Mrs May. Jeremy Corbyn said the choice is strong and stable leadership from Labour.
Under intense pressure, the government fell, forcing a snap election. In a crimson avalanche, the voters sent Jeremy Bernard Corbyn to 10 Downing Street and placed the Labour Party in power. Nothing would ever be the same again.
This is CNN Breaking News.
We're continuing to follow the breaking news. The former British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
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 Finally has been caught after being on the run for more than 10 years. He's an accused war criminal. Let's discuss with Richard Holbrooke, the former U.S. ambassador.
Eggs and shoes were also thrown at the former Prime Minister.
And our main story here on BBC World News, and the world's most wanted man has been tracked down.
Tony Blair, George W. Bush's most visible foreign partner on the war, and he has suffered the consequences for it.
But this guy, in my view, was worse than Milosevic or General Mladic. He was the intellectual leader.
So what do you want? What do you want to happen to him right now? He's going to go on trial.
Well, it is a big issue. You said he was an alleged war criminal.
He hasn't been convicted yet.
He hasn't been convicted, but he's an accused war criminal, and he is indicted in The Hague. Do you turn him over to The Hague, as they did with Milosevic?
What do you want?
I'd like him to go to The Hague.
For a long, that could take years, that trial, as we saw.
Once he goes to The Hague, he's not getting out again. That would be the end of that.
No sooner had he assumed office than Corbyn's spectacular reforms began. Corbyn abolished the monarchy, returning its assets to the National Treasury and converting its land into public allotments. At the same time, he appointed thousands of financial inspectors to examine and expropriate the hidden wealth of the ruling class and tax avoiders. This was discovered to be £10 trillion, equivalent to the entire known wealth of the nation. With the public coffers bursting at the seams, Corbyn renationalised the railways, public transport, all utilities and essential services, erasing the capitalists' rapacious profiteering. Corbyn reinvigorated the National Health Service by investing billions in new technology and hospitals, blazing a trail for the greatest free health provision on the planet. Corbyn slashed unemployment by creating the most radical social housing programme in history, constructing over 1 million quality homes annually. Corbyn decriminalised drug use, diverting funds from prohibition into treatment, and honouring the principles of an old friend, legalised and licensed the sale of marijuana. All centres of private education, including colleges and universities, were incorporated into the Free State system. Corbyn nationalised the financial sector, creating a publicly accountable banking service, eradicating the trade of fictitious value derivatives. After dismantling the noxious media monopolies, he decommissioned the Trident nuclear system, introduced a living wage, made equal pay requisite, banned zero-hour contracts and Uber exploitation, and in a decisive act, a deal was struck with the Argentinian government. In exchange for the sovereignty of the Malvinas, the Argentinians agreed to settle a ship of undesirable exiles to eke out their existence among the sheep and peat bogs of the last colonial outpost. Undoubtedly, though, His most radical initiative was the chemical reformation of Parliament. In order to ensure that MPs upheld the values of integrity and decency demanded by the electorate, Corbyn introduced the right of tryptamine. DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, is a powerful psychedelic compound found in the Amazon basin and consumed for divinatory and healing purposes. Corbyn made the ingestion of DMT mandatory for every MP assuming office, equipping them with a newfound sincerity and elevated sense of social consciousness. So there we have it. Jeremy Corbyn may have long since left us for the great allotment in the sky, yet his legacy and achievements continue to be enjoyed today. So the next time you enjoy a hand transplant on the NHS or travel across town for the price of a Fredo, take a moment to reflect on just exactly what was done.
It's good for my voice, but you won't fool the children of the revolution. Now you won't fool the children of the revolution. Now, now, no. Together